Hey you guys, my name is Juila Williamsome, and I'm going to be lecturing on Chapter 6, Section 5. Key Concept 6.5 states that regulation of enzyme activity helps control metabolism. So some of the ideas that this section covers are allosteric regulation, binding, cooperativity, and feedback inhibition. The first idea that this section addresses is that regulation is crucial to maintaining order in the cell, and that a cell is able to control enzymes by turning on and off their genes and by regulating enzyme activity. The first process that we're going to look at is allosteric regulation. So allosteric regulation is basically an explanation for when a regulatory molecule binds to a protein at one site, which in turn affects the protein's function at another site. This is allosteric regulation in a nutshell. Enzymes that are regulated this way are usually constructed from polypeptide subunits, and each enzyme has two forms, one active and one inactive. These forms are altered when an activator or an inhibitor binds onto the complex, stabilizing it, and either rendering it active or inactive. This is figure 6.18, and the diagram may be a bit hard to make out, but it's just a picture of how active and inactive forms are stabilized by an allosteric activator or an allosteric inhibitor. One thing I forgot to add previously was that the active and inactive forms are oscillating between each other. On to the next concept, cooperativity. Cooperativity is one form of allosteric regulation that amplifies enzyme activity. This concept is considered to be allosteric because what happens after binding a substrate at one site directly affects what happens at another site. This is another portion of figure 6.18, and it illustrates the inactive form becoming stabilized and active because of a substrate that binds to it. The third major concept in this section for you to know about is feedback inhibition. Feedback inhibition is essentially a type of metabolic control where the end product of one metabolic pathway shuts down other parts of the pathway. So imagine that you and a friend of yours are eating some ice cream cones, and then your friend eats way too much, and they just gobble it all down. Then they say, "Oh, I just had way too much. I'm gonna be in a food coma." And then, as a result, they knock your ice cream cone down, and they're like, "Don't make the same mistakes that I did." So it's not the best example, but it'll stick in your head. So it's obvious that my example does not work perfectly, but it kind of illustrates the second point about feedback inhibition in the sense that it prevents you from getting into a food coma or from wasting chemical resources. This is a diagram of feedback inhibition. Feel free to pause and make a doodle of it in your notes, but I won't be spending any time going over it with you. The final major concept that we're going to go through is organization, which is pretty self-explanatory. It just says that since the cell is compartmentalized, structures in the cell prevent chaos from ensuing in metabolic pathways. This slide also gives a nice example about mitochondria, and yeah, that's about it for this one. This slide is pretty straightforward. It's just showing the mitochondria example from the previous slide, and it's saying that the mitochondria has enzymes specific to cell respiration. Review time. So here are some notes that roughly cover the chapter. So allosteric regulation describes the process when one molecule bond in one location affects the function of another location. Then cooperativity is an allosteric regulation form that amplifies enzyme activity. Feedback inhibition is when the final product hinders enzymes from past steps of a pathway in a process. And the fourth one is neat and tidy, which is just my way of saying that there are different forms of organization for enzymes in the cell. Concept check. So I think that you may benefit from quizzing yourself about this chapter. This is just the textbook question that the section generated. So please pause here if you need extra time before you see the answer. And here is the answer. I'll suggest that you pause again if you want to get all the information. Thank you so much for watching. Again, my name is Juila Williamsome, and I am in Miss Johnson-Wormley's Period 4 section.